Hey there, class. Faisal here. July 10th, summer school. Let's go. So, before we dive into the short story, I wanted to talk about a couple of different issues. First of all, about the assignments, you should have gotten your first two reflections back. Your answer to the question of the happy endings assignment, that's going to be coming soon. So you should be getting everything back, right? I'm trying to be fast. Uh, I'm not going to promise that it'll always come 24 hours later, right? Like when you get essays, I'm going to need a day or two. But for now, I'm pretty happy that I'm managing to go this fast. Nevertheless, those should all be back in your classroom, right? Your bright space. So make sure when you get the stuff that you're looking at the feedback, because if you make the same mistake over and over and over, right? You keep putting a comma after although or something like that, right? That's bad, right? So look at my feedback. I'm trying to take the time to tell you, hey, look at this, or hey, look at that. So please be sure to take a close look at it. Right now, a lot of people keep asking me about this. Late marks are not being deducted right now, but let me just tell you all, things need to get done. It's a short class, right? And, I am trying my best to work with you guys. I know that a lot of you have jobs and a lot of you are taking care of your families and everything like that. But it's a short class. If you keep doing things late, you're going to find that you're overwhelmed, right? Especially when we get towards the end. As of today, believe it or not, there are 19 days left in this class, right? So not much time. Let's keep up a good pace. Now, another thing I keep getting asked about in the Q&A section is quotes, so I'm just going to address this again right now. I did mention it in previous videos, but I'll just try to make it very nice and clear. First of all, for these short answer, short story questions, you don't have to cite anything. I know it's from the story, right? And you should not be looking at any secondary source for this, right? If you do, then something's weird. Nevertheless, if you are quoting, you need to follow 3 steps. All right. First, you see here to begin, Atwood's story is centered on death. In her text, Margaret Atwood writes, right? So this part in yellow here that I've got in her text, Margaret Atwood writes, that is me setting up the quote, right? So you can't just throw a quote in, right? If I were to just do it like this, right, where I don't have that and it's just the quote all of a sudden, that's no good because then that leaves the reader thinking, "What? Who's being quoted? What's going on? What's happening?" So just set it up by writing, in her text, Margaret Atwood writes, or whatever thing you're writing about, right? You need something like that to sort of set up the quote. Then you've got the actual quote, and of course it goes between quotation marks. Don't worry about citation for a question like this, right? So I write the quote, you'll have to face it. The endings are the same however you slice it. And then after that is the most important part. This quotation shows that Atwood believes that the inevitable ending of all human stories is death, and that we as human beings cannot escape that. So this part is very important because it's the analysis, right? That's your idea, it's your interpretation of the quotation. So if you have an answer that's just quotations, right? You're saying Margaret Atwood said this, and then Margaret Atwood said that, and then Margaret Atwood said that, right? That's nothing, let me just say, because what that does is it says, here's the quote, you as the reader figure it out. But no, what I want is for you guys to figure it out, right? I want you to tell me your ideas. I don't want you to just give me quotes and then expect me to do the rest. All right, so that's very important. But let's do a quick example question, right? Just so that we can all be fairly clear about the way I want these things to look, right? So I did one right now. Why did Margaret Atwood decide to make this story multiple choice, right? So that's different from your question. So, hopefully you can take this as an example, right? So it says here, Margaret Atwood made this story multiple choice because she wants to analyze different ways that readers approach endings in the span of different genres. You have the fairy tale ending, you have the dramatic endings, and then you have the exciting action movie endings where there is a tidal wave or a revolution. By showing all of these endings together, she is trying to ridicule them and show the readers that our idea of what a romance is distorted and two-dimensional. Whether John and Mary live happily ever after, or they end up fighting against an oppressive government, or just dying, all of these endings are the standard endings and are not inherently special. In her viewpoint, all of these endings are equally cliche and worthy of ridicule. So, what I am trying to do is this answer is number one, I want to have a clear position, right? So here I'm saying that she made all these different endings so that she can mock a whole bunch of different genres, right? That's my first thing. I need to have complete sentences, obviously, right? And I've also got my reasoning with logic and evidence, right? So I'm taking examples from the story of the tidal wave, the revolution, and all of that, and I'm explaining to the readers what they mean. Now, a couple of people in the Q&A yesterday or today said, can I make this longer than 7 sentences? And you can. I'm not going to penalize you if you go a bit long. But do know that for this kind of answer, right, it's not supposed to be too long and it's not supposed to be too short. Anyhow, so that's what you're doing for these short answers. So right now, I'm going to turn it over to the long-haired version of myself because I've already made what I think is a pretty good video about our next story, the King of the Raft. But actually, before I do that, in order to get the King of the Raft, you just go, as always, to the Content tab right here. You go to Short Stories, you click on King of the Raft, and there's a PDF of it right there, right? And that should set you straight, right? So it's not as long as the other one. Oh, well, it's about as long as the other one. It's not long. Anyway, so I'm going to turn it over to the long-haired version of myself. So, this story is a story that certainly can be a little bit confusing. And before we talk about its content, in order to understand the story, you need to understand a little something about the author and where he's coming from, because this was written by an Aboriginal Canadian. So, Aboriginal people in Canada have a very tragic history, and it has a lot to do with colonialism. Now, every country in the world is touched by colonialism in one way or the other, right? I know many of you come from countries in Africa or Asia, and certainly most countries in the world have that experience of colonialism in their history. But when it comes to the Canadian Aboriginal experience of colonialism, uh, they essentially got it a lot worse than any other country, right? And I'll try to explain that using, well, let's just use the simple numbers. So, the Aboriginal people are also called the First Nations because they were first, right? They arrived in Canada before anyone else, right? And today in Canada, this is from Statistics Canada, they represent 4.9% of the population of Canada, with the other 95.1% being, well, people that aren't them. So, I want you to think back, especially those of you who are first generation immigrants and came from elsewhere. Think back to your own country and imagine your people, your main ethnicity, right, being reduced to 4.9% and other people being 95%. Now, granted, there are places in the world where that has happened, right? But it certainly has happened here in Canada, where the Aboriginal population has been reduced to a minority of minorities. Now, this is not a history class, so I don't have time to go through every single detail here. I'm not going to go through the dates and everything like that, but I'm going to give you guys, especially those of you who perhaps have not studied this before, just a basic overview of what happened to the Aboriginal people. So, when the European colonizers came, many Aboriginal tribes were wiped out, especially on the east coast of Canada, closest to the Europeans. Some were destroyed outright with guns. Others were destroyed by disease brought by the Europeans, right? Specifically, a disease called smallpox, right? Smallpox had been in Europe for quite some time, right? But it had not been in Canada before, right? So, as we all know from the coronavirus epidemic, right? If a disease is around for a long time, people start to build antibodies. But if it's new, it really can deal a lot of damage. So many Aboriginal tribes were wiped out by smallpox, and the Europeans, by the way, were happy that that was happening, and in many cases promoted it. So you had a lot of Aboriginal tribes and people slaughtered in one way or the other when the Europeans first came in that way. Then you have after the society is decimated, you have the Aboriginals sent to places called reserve. These red dots you see on the map are what we call Indian reserves, even though we don't call them Indians anymore. Um, so these are where the Aboriginal tribes were sent to. As you can see, by the way, there's a lot more on the west coast than there are on the east coast, and that's because, again, the Indians that were over here, I shouldn't say Indians, the Aboriginals that were over here were the first to encounter the Europeans and their smallpox and everything like that. So they didn't survive, whereas it took longer for them to get to the west, so there are more reserves there as a consequence. Nevertheless, these reserves are tiny plots of land that the Aboriginals were given as they were pushed out of the rest of the country, right? So basically, when Canada was colonizing Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, right, and there was a lot of farmland there, right, they would say to the Aboriginals, all right, you guys stay out of the rest of this land. It's ours now. And, we're going to put you in these reserves. And, everything else belongs to us, right? So, Aboriginal people, well, they didn't have a choice but to accept that because the colonizers had guns and the Aboriginal people did not. So that's why these treaties were sort of forced upon them, right? And they were then forced into these reserves, right, or reservations. So, but it doesn't stop there, right? So first we've had the physical destruction from guns and disease. Then we've got the reserves. Then we've got the third blow that Canada inflicts, which is residential schools. Right? Residential schools are schools created by the government in partnership with the Protestant and Catholic churches, right? And those schools had children forced out of the reserves, right? So they would where's there? They would go into one of these reserves and they'd say to the parents, "Give us your kids, right? Regardless of if you want to send them there or not, and we're going to take them to these schools, right?" And on the surface, that might not sound as bad to you, but well, they're forced away from their families, right? And they're brought to these schools where they're taught three things. First of all, they're converted to Christianity, right, from their native religion, right? Forced conversion is the first part. Second, they're taught English, right? And at the same time, forced to stop speaking their own language. And third, there's a whole bunch of physical and sexual abuse that's taking place at these schools, right? So, there were kids that were literally kidnapped away from their parents, and you can imagine, without parental protection, these kids were, brutalized. So, this happened over the course of hundreds of years, right? Or I should say, yeah, about 200 years, I would say. I would need to go back and check the dates. But nevertheless, what they would do is they would take these kids from their families, right, put them through the schooling system. Often the kids would forget their own language because they're forced to only speak English, right? Physically and sexually abuse them. And then after that, right, they get sent back to the reserves, right? So it's not like you go into a residential school, you learn English, and then maybe you can come to Toronto and get a job. No, they were sent back to the reserves, and what that did is you had generations of children who couldn't talk to their parents, right? Because they are removed from their own place, right? And they also have kids that have been taught by their teachers that their parents are heathens, right? That their parents, are backward savages and everything like that, right? So that's what Canada did to this population, and uh, the result is Aboriginal culture and society was decimated, right? And the damage is something that is still being repaired to this day, right? Justin Trudeau issued an apology for the reservation schools, as did the previous Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, right? So, there's been a lot of attempts to repair this damage. So, that brings us back to King of the Raft. So, the King of the Raft. It's another postmodern story, just like much Aboriginal fiction often is. And the first thing you'll notice about this story is the naming thing, right? Because the names of characters are constantly changing, right? We see here, there was a raft in the river that year, put there anchored with an anvil just below a bend by one of the fathers who worked away in Buffalo, who could spend only every other weekend, if that, at home. The one of the mothers whose husband worked the land and came in from the fields for every meal muttered, as she set the table, that raft was only way the father who worked in the city was able to pretend he cared about his sons. Her husband, also one of the fathers, who had once when young gone across the border to work and then unhappy there returned, could not answer, soaking the dust of soil from his hands. So, you'll notice no names, right? Everyone is called either a father or a son or a boy, right? It's all done without names. And, well, there's perhaps a reason for that, right? That we will perhaps, this might be something we discuss in our next seminar, even, right? Why there aren't any names. But that's the main confusion when it comes to this story. But I'm here to help you out, and I'm here to tell you that even though it might seem you're dealing with a lot of different characters in this book, there are really only two that you are worried about, right? Let's see. You've got there's this boy here. The boys use, this is the second page, third paragraph. The boys use that raft in the murky green water to catch the sun, or their breaths on, or to dive from where they try to touch their mud bottom. One of the younger ones also used to stand across the current to the other side, trying to see that field of corn there, the last bit of land that belonged to the reserve. Beyond it, the highway ran, a border patrolled by a few cars flashing chrome in the sun or headlights through the evening blue, like messages from the city. Every one of the boys used the raft several times that summer to get across the river and back, the accomplishment proof of their new masculinity, and once the younger one, who spent time looking at that other land, crossed and climbed up the bank there, and explored the shadows between the row of corms, the leaves like dry tongues, along his naked arms as he came to the field's far edge where the asphalt of the highway stood empty. So, there's one boy in there, this younger boy, who I'm going to call the highway boy, right? That is essentially the protagonist of the story. He's called a lot of different things throughout the story, right? So I can even put an AKA here, right? He's also called the boy who almost drowned, right? Uh, and other things like that. But it is all referring to the same character, right? So that is one of our characters here. And then there's the other character, who is, of course, the King of the Raft, right? Let's quickly look at him here. Years later, one of the oldest boys... Wait, hang on, let me just find the King of the Raft's introduction. Oh yeah, here it is, right there. I'm the king of the raft, he yelled, challenging the boy who had seen the highway to win that wet wooden square, and a battle was joined, and the day was wet and fair, until the king of the raft, to show his strength to the rest of the boys still on shore, took a hank of the highway boy's straight hair in hand, and held the highway boy underwater till the highway boy saw blue fire and almost drowned. Right? So, the king of the raft is the boy who is, dunking the highway boy under the water, right? So, he dunks the highway boy under the water, right? So he nearly drowns him. Uh, and we see that after that, the king of the raft is in a whole lot of trouble, right? Because, well, he almost killed one of the other boys, so obviously the highway boys' parents get angry at him and everything like that, right? So it might seem like a lot of characters are around and that there's a lot of different boys, but really they just are the same boys being called different things, right? So that is the first thing to know about this, right? Is that there might be a lot of different names, but essentially two characters: Highway Boy, King of the Raft. Now, this story is heavy on symbolism, right? Which, as you all know, is when a put that up. There we go. When something or someone in a story represents an idea, right? So, symbolism is very strong in this story, right? It's a very, again, postmodern story that is sort of um, trying to bring across a message, right? And it's important to look at some of the symbolism that's happening in this particular story. So I'm going to call your guys' attention to a simple one, right? And that is the color blue, right? Let's take a look here. We've got, I think, 4 instances of the color blue in this story. First one, and probably the most important one, is... where is it? I just read it. Yes, when the King of the Raft is on page 3, by the way, is trying to drown the highway boy, right? What does the highway boy see? Well, he sees blue fire. Right? So that seems to suggest, because he's drowning, that blue fire means death, right? So let's even put that down. Blue fire, it means death, right? That's, there's death over there. And in fact, if we look at the King of the Raft's hair, right, we'll also see, and the boy who almost had drowned found he both feared the King of the Raft and missed the blue waves in his blue-black hair, right? So the King of the Raft has got some blue in his hair too, right? So perhaps there's something to connect it with there. But there's another time we see blue fire and this blue-black hair, right? And that's on the next page, page 4, right? Where it says here, well, first of all, the King of the Raft meets the boy again, and he has some beer, right? He has some alcohol, right? And over there, we see this line. Let's see. The King of the Raft was going away with his father to live in Buffalo in the United States, and thought the boy who had almost drowned could use what was left of this beer the king's father would never miss. The boy who had almost drowned sipped from his bottle of sour beer and heard the rain beginning to hiss at the end of the culvert. He crawled and looked out in time to see the blue fire of lightning hit a tree. In the flash, he saw again the waves in the king's blue-black hair, the grin that offered another beer. Right? So, here it is. We see blue fire comes when he's drowning and when the king offers beer. Now, It's a common stereotype in Canada that Aboriginal people have problems with alcoholism. Now, that, first of all, is not, it is a stereotype, right? Many Aboriginal people, in fact, most, do not have such problems. But it is true to say that after the reservation schools or residential schools um, decimated Aboriginal culture and people, right? And you had these broken families where the kids couldn't speak the language of their parents, right? After that happened, yes, there were certainly a lot of social problems in the residential or reserves, right? Including alcoholism, right? So we could perhaps say something here. Now, the story does end with the King of the Raft dying, right? We don't know exactly how, right? He went there, and it says at the bottom of that same page, a rumor came around about his going to work in the city, and in winter another one claimed he had died. The boy who had crossed through the rain thought about going down even quicker in winter traffic. Then a newspaper confirmed the death in a traffic accident, the Rain Boy read. So that is how the King of the Raft ends up dying. He goes to America, he leaves the reservation, and then he is killed. Right? So this is a story that has a bit of a mysterious aura to it. But, well, my challenge to you guys today will be for you to try to figure it out. So let's look at the question of the day. So at this point, I'm going to take over, right? Short-haired Faisal again. So, hope you found the video useful. So your question is going to be about symbolism as well, right? Just like in the video, I was talking about the raft, or not the raft, the color blue, and how that color represents death. Your question for today, let me put this in big letters, is, let's put that right here. Yes, in the short story Cave of the Raft, what does the raft symbolize? What is the message being told by the story? So, that raft is very important, right, for understanding what this story is getting at. And it's also very important, here, let me give you a big tip right now. Think about Canadian history, right? Because you had a raft, right? And I'm going to give a couple of hints here, but I'm not going to go too far. You had a raft that, all of the boys were sharing, right? And everything like that. And they were all getting along, but then all of a sudden this outsider comes and says that he's the king of the raft, right? And that term king, right? It's not an Aboriginal term, right? It's not from the First Nations, right? That is a European term. So, maybe we can think about that when it comes to figuring out what this raft means. So, just like last time, this one should be about 6, 7 sentences, same thing as the happy endings answer. And you are going to give that to me by tonight. And once you have done that, you will have reached the weekend, right? And the first week of this class is, well, almost done. But before we finish that, we should know that tomorrow as well at 2 o'clock, we're going to have our first Google Meetup. So again, the way to get to that meetup, most of you guys have been coming for the questions and answers, not everyone, but most, is you click on Virtual Classroom, like so, right? And then you'll see an active meeting. Right now there isn't an active meeting, right? But you'll just click it and you'll hit join or you'll hit launch, right? And then that should bring you into a meeting, right? Couple of things. There is an option to use your phone after you've joined a meeting to uh, get into the discussion, right? So if your microphone isn't working, you can call in. So hang on, let me show you guys that. What you shall do, right, is you'll see, right, there'll be a meeting, right, and you'll just hit launch, right? Launch is the thing to hit, right? And it'll say audio and video, recording, and all that, right? It'll give you an explanation of how to do this, right? So you'll hit enter meeting room, and you'll get a bunch of prompts, right? Saying, well, how do you want to join, right? I'm gonna put, you know,
You are currently the only person in this conference.
yeah, I know no one else is here, right? So you just join like that, right? It'll ask you permission to use your microphone. You'll see a bunch of things pop up saying, can we use this? Can we use that?" And you'll hit allow. But the key is, if you can't get your microphone to work, right? Just see this right here, right? There's numbers you can call, right? 289-806-4101, right? And then you enter the code 82263 number. It'll probably be a different code on that day, but that's how you can get into the meeting, right? And it's important that everyone attend because this is part of your oral communication mark. Very important. Now, for this meeting, right? Like I said yesterday, our topics are going to be three things, right? We'll definitely be talking about masks. That's going to be section one. Then we'll be talking about guns, right? And if we have time, we'll talk about happy endings. And if we still have time after that, we'll talk about King of the Raft. But essentially, what you're going to be doing is hearing each other's ideas on masks. I can tell you most of you agree on guns, right? Most people said about the same thing. So it seems like we have a very pro gun control class, which is good, by the way, because I agree too. But you'll be hearing each other's ideas. People will talk one at a time, right? And it's just an opportunity to share, talk to each other, hear each other's voices, and everything like that. So you can say about the same things you said in your reflections, but it's a conversation. Um, and that's what we shall be doing. So the meeting, let me make sure everyone's clear on this. So the seminar meeting is taking place at 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the virtual classroom, right? And again, this is not a Q&A, right? This is going to be you guys talking intelligently about this section, the material, right? So this is part of your oral communication mark, right? So in that mark, I'm going to be looking at a couple of different things. Number one is how well you express yourself. Do your ideas make sense? Everything like that. I'm going to be looking at whether you are clear, right, and whether you can contribute to the discussion effectively. So that's what I'll be looking at. If you absolutely cannot speak, you can type at the very least, but do make sure you're part of this discussion. Okay, so guys, we're finished the first week. I know I've been giving you a bunch of work, but more work is coming. Second week, you're going to have an essay, so look forward to that. And I will talk to you all today at 2 o'clock. So for now, I hope you're all having a good Friday, and I'll see you all at 2.